G'day guys, my name's Taz, and that's Steve, my Gen 2 1994 XV750 or Virago 750. Picked this bike up a couple of months ago. I've really enjoyed riding it. It will be the focus of Budget Bobber Build Season 3, but before we start messing with it, I thought we would take it for a ride and do an owner's review. Let's jump on. Join me, guys. So first things first, I've owned an XV250, or I've actually technically owned two of them. I've owned an XVS650, an XVS1100, but this is the bike that I've always wanted. Not sure I'd say it's my dream bike, but I've been after one for years. And I finally picked one up in Devonport for an absolute bargain, and it's an absolute mint version of the Mark. First started in the 80s, and the original XV750 had a monoshock on the back, and then this Gen 2 has dual shocks on the back. Gen 1 has become really popular for cafe racer conversions, and I'm not a huge fan of that look on them, but it is what it is. People go with what they like. I like the bobber style, so I was really keen to get a Gen 2. Somewhere in the 80s there, instead of being a 750, they dropped it to 700 because these bikes became known as the Harley Killer. And it's got about 55 horsepower and about 65 newton meters of torque. And if those figures sound vaguely familiar, that's pretty much identical to the 883 Harley Davidson Sportster. These are cheaper and more economical, lighter and much more reliable than Harleys of the same age. So Harley Davidson lobbied to put a tariff on bikes over 750cc's to remove the competition from Japanese bikes on their Sportster, which is the smallest bike that they made at the time. Yamaha said screw you, and they dropped the capacity from 750 to 700 to beat the tariff. So this bike was a tariff buster, and then once the tariff was lifted, they bumped it back up to 750. So the 750's got about the same amount of power as an 883, and the 1100 about the same amount of power as a 1200 Sportster. So 55 horsepower doesn't sound like much, but it's very torquey, it's very usable, whips up these hills really nicely. So compared to the XVS650, which is about 40 horsepower, this is a noticeable increase. To continue with the history lesson, XV series evolved into the XVS or V-Star series. So Dizzy and Izzy by 1100 and 650. The 650 being the focus of Budget Bobber Build Season 2, evolved from this bike. So this is the grandfather of Gilby, the XV250 and the XVS650 and 1100 that I have. It's a beautiful bike. Ergonomically, it's much smaller than a Sportster. Makes it very comfortable for a smaller rider. And it sits up higher than the XVS, so you can tip it into the corners much more easily. So it's lighter and handles better and has more power, noticeably more power than the 650. Up front, you've got a 100 by 90 by 19 tyre. On an alloy rim, so therefore it's a tubeless tyre. Plenty of fork travel, lots of chrome on the bike, and you've got both speedo and tacho and a whole bunch of idiot lights. Similar to a Sportster, there's a shroud at the front that sort of covers between the light and this binnacle here. The handlebars of the XV750 are a real talking point. When I first bought this bike, I absolutely hated them. Granted, the guy that owned it was much taller than me, so they were in a different position. And so I got some Allen keys out and I changed the position to what suits me. And now, actually, I really like them. They're not pretty, but they're real comfortable and real functional, and that's pretty much the story of this entire bike. The bike is very much a throwback of the 80s, but it was still available into the 90s. This is a 94, and I think 94 was about the last year that they were made. Or maybe not. This is a 94, and 97 I think was the last year that they were made, and then 98 was the first year of the XVS 650 that replaced it. The switchgear is what you'd expect. Comfortable, functional, all buttons in the right places. 2 horns, so it's really loud. You can easily tell people to F off with those horns. There's one actually on each side of the frame. You can actually see the XV250 Gilby in this bike. Switchgear. Is all very similar. These I don't believe are the stock mirrors, but they're very similar. I believe the stock mirror had a stalk there and then it came off, but these are very, very similar. And yet again, square mirrors, not pretty, but works really well. Up front you've got dual discs. At the back you've got a drum brake. The tank is interesting because it sort of sits underneath you. Some of the earlier Viragos actually had an auxiliary tank in underneath the seat, which kept the weight low. This is a 13 litre tank. I find I do about 230 kilometres before I'm looking for a service station to fill up. So instead of the tank being right in your stomach like the V-Star or even something like a Sportster, this is sort of sitting underneath you. The weight is quite low. It seems to feel taller and shorter than something like the V-Star. So it sits up higher, and it means that it does handle really well. It wants to tip into the corners. You've got to really lean it over before you're scraping the pegs. Speaking of pegs, it's mid-mount control. And I've always wanted a cruiser with mid-mount controls. I'm not a tall guy at all, 165 centimetres. So instead of feet out here, these my legs sit at a 90-degree angle, and it's very comfortable. The seat, I think it's tied with the stock seat on an XV250 has been the most plush, comfortable seat I've ever ridden. It's big, it's bulky, it's got a huge pillion pad. It's sort of almost got a king and queen seat on it. It's got a sissy bar with a big plush sissy bar pad. Very much set up for pillion riding. I'm pretty sure this bike would be pretty comfortable for carrying a passenger, and it very easily sits on Australia's national speed limit of 110 kilometres an hour. It's got more than enough torque to sit on 110 in my opinion with a pillion passenger. Dual suspension on the rear. I think they're 320mm from memory. Adjustable preload. Like the rest of the bike, really soft. Easy to ride. Could absolutely churn up the miles on this bike. Brakes are adequate. Of course, there's no ABS. So my XV750 is probably the best brake cruiser I've ever owned or ridden. This, even though it's got dual discs up the front, it's not quite as efficient as the 1100, but still more than adequate. Back brake sounds very primitive being a drum, but it is actually very adequate, and it's not very grabby. Some drum brakes can be very grabby and skiddy. This, I've yet to get the back brake to lock up. This is shaft drive, connected to a 5-speed gearbox, and the gear ratios are fantastic. On the XV750, the bike is screaming a bit at 110. It's got plenty left in it, but people do complain about the revs you're doing at higher speeds. This bike seems to have taller gearing, longer gearing, so you're in each gear for longer, and it makes it much more usable and much more rideable. It is designed for all riders. It's unrestricted, so it's designed to be a cruiser. So first, second and third give you good acceleration around town, and then fourth and fifth give you great cruising ability on the highway. This bike has got aftermarket pipes on it, and whoever's owned it, it's only had, I'm the third owner, it's only had 2 owners previous to me. great engine, and it sounds really good through the aftermarket pipes. I'm not 100% sure, but I think they're Jardine, and whoever's put them on, I believe it was the original owner, has obviously had it jetted. Doesn't spit or backfire, pop or fart. Brown Falcon. It starts very easily, doesn't need choke for long, even on a real cold morning like this morning. Just runs as sweet as the day it rolled off the showroom floor. Now be fairly careful because it's quite icy, and the front tyres bolder than what I would be comfortable riding with normally. Hence why I'm getting it replaced tomorrow. But such a beautiful morning, I thought I'd take it out for a ride and talk about this bike with you guys. Let's talk about the styling, because it's the most divisive aspect of a Virago. You either love them or hate them. It's very much a Marmite bike. Nothing in between. It's black or white. Love it or hate it. And I think it's great. I think it's got a lot of character. The XVS series looks much more classic Harley-like. This has got its own style. It's very comfortable. You're very upright. It's very soft and plush. High quality. Reliable. It's certainly not a head turner, but it's a fantastic motorcycle that you could own for years as your one and only big bike that you ever ride, in my opinion. It's a fantastic motorcycle, really, really happy with it. So who's the bike for? Riders of shorter stature. Again, I'm only 165 centimeters tall, and I fit on this bike perfectly. The guy that I bought it from was probably a good foot taller than me, and he rode it really nicely with his wife, and they loved it. He was an older rider, and he was selling it because of his knee. So it's probably good for older riders, your first big bike, people that like classics, people that want a cruiser but don't want a Harley Davidson. They're very, very popular in the modification scene. Anyone who wants to tinker with a cruiser, turn it into a bobber or a cafe racer, XV750 absolutely for you. So guys, I'm gonna sign off and enjoy my ride on this beautiful cold autumn morning. Join me next week when we start stripping off all the touring gear that comes on this motorcycle, as we get down to the budget bobber build, season 3 build. So in the next few videos we're going to strip off the touring gear and start lightening this bike and slimming it down a little bit. Hope you'll join me. If you're new here, please consider subscribing, like, comment, share. Guys, my name's Alright Taz. Till I see you next time, I'm out. Cheers.